I never told my daughter about my $85,000 a month salary. Her husband threw my things out the door. "Get out of this house, you poor old woman!" But a month later, I bought the house of their dreams right across the street. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Collins, and for 34 years, I kept a rule that most people would consider strange. I never discuss money with family, not because I was ashamed of it. Quite the opposite. I had simply watched over the course of a long career in financial consulting how the knowledge of wealth changes people. It doesn't matter how much they love you before they know. After Sia, everything shifts, like furniture rearranged in a room you thought you knew by heart. I earned my income the slow, disciplined way. After my husband Robert passed from a heart attack 3 years ago, I converted my consulting practice to remote work and restructured my portfolio. By the time I was 62, I was bringing in $85,000 a month. Between my consulting retainer clients, dividend income, and the rental properties Robert and I had accumulated over 2 decades. It wasn't flashy money, it was patient money. The kind that sits quietly and grows. I drove a 2019 Honda CR-V. I wore slacks from Talbots and good walking shoes. I brought casseroles to neighborhood functions and clipped grocery coupons out of habit, not necessity. No one would have looked at me and seen what I actually was. When Robert died, my daughter Claire suggested I come stay with her and her husband Derek in their 3-bedroom colonial in Maplewood, New Jersey. "Just until you find your footing, Mom," she'd said. I thought it would be 3 months. It turned into 14. Claire was 34. She worked part-time as a dental hygienist. Derek was 38. A sales manager at a mid-tier software company who spoke constantly about his potential and his 5-year plan, the way people do when they haven't yet achieved anything worth talking about. He was handsome in a forgettable way, the kind of man who is charming at parties and impatient at home. In those first months, things were fine. I cooked. I helped with housework. I stayed out of their way. I paid for groceries, quietly, consistently, and occasionally handed Claire an envelope with cash for household expenses. She never asked questions about where it came from. Derek never asked either, though I noticed that he smiled more warmly on the weeks when the envelope appeared. The warning signs came slowly, the way they always do. The first was the tone. Derek began to speak to me the way people speak to a piece of furniture they're considering moving to storage. Short sentences, no eye contact, sighs that weren't quite sighs, but weren't quite anything else either. He started referring to my bedroom as the guest room in conversations he didn't realize I could hear. The guest room needs a new curtain rod. We should probably clear out the guest room for the holidays. The second was the financial probing. Subtle at first. "Mom, do you have any savings from Dad's life insurance?" Claire asked one Sunday, her voice casual, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I told her we had been comfortable. She nodded and didn't push, but I caught the look she exchanged with Derek across the kitchen island, a brief, loaded look that I filed away like a document I wasn't ready to open yet. The third was the entitlement. Derek began leaving his gym bag in the hallway outside my room. His tools appeared in my closet. The shelf in the bathroom I'd been using was slowly colonized by his shaving equipment and supplements. Each intrusion was small enough to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. Would things have escalated if I had been more assertive? Perhaps. Would they have changed if I had finally told them what I was worth? Absolutely, but not in the direction I would have wanted. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I had spent the afternoon on a video call with a client in Boston, reviewing a quarterly portfolio update. I was still in my reading glasses when I heard Derek's voice in the kitchen, sharp and tight in a way that meant he'd had a bad day at work and had decided to transfer the weight of it elsewhere. I came downstairs to find my 2 suitcases on the front porch. My winter coat was draped over one of them. My reading lamp, the one Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, was balanced on top. Derek stood in the doorway. Claire was somewhere behind him, silent. "I think it's time you found your own place," he said. His jaw was set. His eyes were flat. "You've been here over a year. This isn't working for us anymore. Claire agrees." I looked past him at my daughter. She was studying the floor. "You need to go," Derek said. "Tonight." I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he shifted his weight slightly, and then I picked up my coat and walked to my car. "Tonight," I thought, turning the key in the ignition. "All right, Derek. Tonight." But I was already thinking about tomorrow. The Hampton Inn off Route 22 was $43 cheaper than the Marriott and had a parking lot with decent lighting, which mattered more to me in that moment than thread count. I sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on and my reading glasses in my hand, and I did what I always do when I'm afraid. I made a list. What did I have? My laptop, my phone, my car, my portfolio. Untouched, unaffected, worth more than Derek's house and everything in it. My health, my clear-headedness. 34 years of professional experience and a network of colleagues and attorneys and financial advisors who returned my calls within the hour. What had I lost? A bedroom in my daughter's house. The fiction that my family was safe. I allowed myself 45 minutes of fear. I sat with it, cataloged it, let it move through me. The fear of being 62 and alone. The fear of what this meant about Claire, not about Derek. I'd never trusted Derek. But about Claire, who had stood behind her husband and said nothing while her mother's lamp sat on a cold porch. That fear was the sharpest one. I set it aside carefully. I wasn't ready to examine it yet. Sharp things require the right tools. Then I opened my laptop. The insult had been intimate and public all at once. Derek had thrown me out with no notice, no legal warning, no consideration of the fact that I had been contributing financially to that household for over a year. In the state of New Jersey, I knew, informal tenancy arrangements carry certain protections. He couldn't have legally forced me out that night. But I hadn't argued. Not because I didn't know my rights, but because I saw something in that moment more valuable than a legal victory. I saw exactly who Derek was, unmasked, in full light, and I decided I would not waste that vision. I called my attorney, Helen Marsh, the next morning. Helen had been my lawyer for 19 years and had the particular quality I valued most in counsel. She listened completely before she spoke. I described the situation. She confirmed what I already knew, that Derek's action had been legally questionable given the duration of my stay and my financial contributions. She advised me to document everything, the date, what was said, the items placed outside. I had already written it all down in a notes app on my phone the night before. "What do you want to do?" Helen asked. "I want to find a furnished short-term rental," I said. "Something decent, and then I want to buy a property." There was a brief pause. "In Maplewood?" "Yes," I said. "In Maplewood, ideally on the same street." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Okay, Maggie, I'll pull in a real estate contact." I spent the next 3 days at the Hampton Inn, working my regular hours from a small desk by the window, taking client calls, reviewing reports. I told no one in my professional life what had happened. There was no reason to. My work was undisturbed. My income was undisturbed. Only my personal life had cracked open, and I'd been in that position before. You survive by keeping the professional machinery running while you quietly rebuild everything else. On the third day, I found a furnished apartment 2 miles from Claire's house, a clean 2-bedroom on the second floor of a restored Victorian. I signed a 6-month lease. I moved my suitcases out of the Hampton Inn and hung Robert's reading lamp on a hook by the front door, where it cast a warm circle of light across the hallway floor. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened the property listings Helen's contact had sent me. There it was, 412 Sycamore Lane, directly across from Claire and Derek's house at 409. A 4-bedroom craftsman-style home, built in 1924, recently renovated, listed at $740,000. Hardwood floors, a deep front porch, a magnolia tree in the yard that I could see in the listing photos just beginning to drop its leaves for autumn. I had been inside that house once, 3 years ago, when it had briefly been an Airbnb. I had admired the crown molding in the living room and the original glass doorknobs. I had thought then, absently, that it was the kind of house a person would be lucky to live in. Was it revenge? Not exactly. Revenge is impulsive, and impulsive decisions are expensive. What I felt sitting at that table was something colder and more purposeful, a settling of accounts. Derek had decided I was a powerless old woman who could be moved like furniture. I intended to demonstrate, quietly, legally, and permanently, exactly how wrong he was. I picked up the phone and called Helen. "I want to make an offer on the property at 412 Sycamore," I said. "Cash, full asking price. I'd like to move quickly." "How quickly?" "As quickly as the law allows." She laughed, a short, surprised sound. "I'll call the listing agent this afternoon." I hung up, finished my coffee, and opened my laptop to begin the client work waiting for me. Outside the window of my rented apartment, a November wind moved through the trees. 2 miles away on Sycamore Lane, Derek was going about his Tuesday without any awareness that I had just pulled the first thread of a plan that would, in time, unravel everything he'd built his sense of power upon. That thought didn't make me happy exactly, but it made me steady, and steady was enough. The listing agent's name was Patricia Okafor, and she was everything I needed her to be. Efficient, discreet, and unimpressed by drama. We met at the property on a Thursday morning. I walked through the rooms in my good coat, taking my time, asking the right questions. The kitchen had been updated in the last 5 years. The roof was 3 years old. The furnace had been replaced. The bones were excellent. "Is there any flexibility on price?" Patricia asked. "No," I said. "I'm offering full asking cash. I want a 21-day close." She looked at me with the focused attention real estate professionals give to clients who don't negotiate downward. "I'll present it today." Helen met me afterward at her office on South Orange Avenue. We reviewed the purchase structure. I would hold the property in a limited liability company I'd established years earlier for my rental properties, which meant my name would not appear on any public-facing documents in a straightforward search. There were legitimate tax and liability reasons for this arrangement. There was also the not incidental benefit that Derek, if he went looking, would not immediately find me. "He'll figure it out eventually," Helen said. "Eventually is fine," I said. "I need a head start." While I was meeting with Patricia and Helen, I was unaware that 72 hours earlier, Something had happened that I would only learn about later. Something that transformed this from a personal hurt into something I needed to treat with legal seriousness. I found out on a Saturday from Claire herself. She called me, which surprised me. It was the first time she'd reached out since the night Derek had put my things on the porch. Her voice had the careful, pressed quality of someone who has rehearsed their opening line. "Mom, I'm sorry about how things happened. Derek was stressed, and he overreacted. Overreacted. I let that word sit in the air between us without responding to it. We were wondering," she continued, "if you'd be willing to have lunch, just the two of us." We met at a cafe in Summit the following Tuesday. Claire looked tired. She'd pulled her dark hair back tightly, which she only did when she was anxious, and she ordered a salad she barely touched. We talked around the edges of things for 20 minutes before I let the silence stretch long enough that she filled it. "Derek thinks," she started, then stopped. "We've been struggling a little, financially." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Derek thought maybe, since you were staying with us for so long, maybe there was something you could do to help, more formally, like a loan arrangement. Or even," and here her voice dropped, "if you had any assets Dad left you, a portion of the estate that isn't tied up." I felt the chill move through me, and I recognized it immediately. Not surprise, confirmation. "Did Derek suggest you ask me this?" She looked at her salad. "We talked about it together." I set down my coffee cup. "Claire, has Derek ever asked you to look into my financial accounts? Any of them? Online or through statements or any other way?" The pause that followed was its own answer. But she gave me a verbal one, too, after a moment, because Claire had never been a skilled liar. "He asked me to look at the bank statements from when Dad died," she said quietly. "The ones I helped you organize after the funeral. He said he just wanted to understand the estate structure. I didn't think it was—" "Did you share them with him?" Silence. "Claire." "I showed him the summary page," she whispered. "I didn't think it was wrong." I took a breath. The summary page from Robert's estate wouldn't have told Derek much. The accounts had been reorganized since then, but the intent was unmistakable. Derek had used my daughter to try to assess my net worth. He had done it while I was living under his roof. And when the number, whatever number he'd pieced together, hadn't satisfied him, or perhaps when he'd realized the accounts were shielded from easy access, he'd decided I wasn't worth the hospitality. He hadn't thrown me out because I was a burden. He'd thrown me out because he'd concluded I wasn't valuable enough to keep. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I thought about Claire, not with anger yet, but with a kind of sorrowful clarity. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had chosen a man who diminished her, and over the years she had reorganized her own moral compass to stay aligned with his. I had watched it happen slowly, the way you watch a garden go to weed. You notice. You say nothing, hoping it will correct itself. And then one season you look up and the garden is gone. That evening, I called Helen and told her what I'd learned. "Does that change anything for you legally?" I asked. "It depends on what he did with the information," she said, "but it's worth documenting." Dates, what Claire described, as precisely as you can remember it. I opened my notes app and typed for 40 minutes. I documented everything. Claire's language, the sequence of events, the timeline of Derek's behavior in the months before he'd put my things on the porch. When I finished, I had 4 single-space pages. Then I checked my email. Patricia Okafor had written at 6:47 p.m. "Offer accepted. Congratulations. We'll schedule inspections for next week." I read the email twice. Then I closed my laptop and sat for a while in the lamplight, Robert's lamp, casting its familiar glow, and thought about magnolia trees and crown molding and the view from the front porch of 412 Sycamore Lane. Derek's living room window would be visible from that porch. I found that thought, unexpectedly, very peaceful. The inspection went well. The inspector found 2 minor issues: a slow drain in the upstairs bathroom and a section of weather stripping on the back door that needed replacing. I asked for neither a price reduction nor a credit. I said I would handle them myself. Patricia seemed pleased by this. Sellers like clean closings. They like buyers who don't find reasons to unravel. I closed on 412 Sycamore Lane on a Thursday morning in late November, 31 days after Derek had placed my suitcases on the porch of his house across the street. The LLC held the title. The check cleared. Patricia handed me 2 sets of keys with a professionally warm smile and told me the magnolia would be spectacular in spring. I thanked her and drove to the property alone. I stood on the front porch for a while. The air was cold and smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the block. Across the street, number 409 sat dark and ordinary in the gray November light. Derek's truck was in the driveway. Claire's car was not. I went inside and walked through each room slowly, the way you do when a space is becoming yours rather than something you're only passing through. I stood at the living room window and looked out at the street. I stood in the kitchen and thought about what I would plant in the backyard. I sat on the stairs and called Helen. "It's done," I said. "Congratulations, Maggie," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Clear," I said, and that was the exact right word. I spent the first week arranging for movers to bring my things from the apartment. I ordered a sofa, something I'd actually chosen for myself, not Robert's, not Claire's, not anything inherited or provisional. I hung Robert's lamp in the study. I bought a kitchen table with 6 chairs because I intended, eventually, to fill them. Derek found out on a Saturday. I don't know precisely how. Maplewood is a small town, and small towns have permeable information. Perhaps a neighbor mentioned the sale. Perhaps he saw the moving truck. Perhaps Claire had sources I wasn't aware of. What I know is that at 10:15 on a Saturday morning, while I was arranging bookshelves in the living room, a car pulled up in front of my house and Derek got out. He stood on my front walk and stared at the house for a moment with an expression I recognized, the specific blankness of a person experiencing a reality they had not prepared for. Then he came up the porch steps and knocked on the door. I opened it. I did not invite him in. "Is this a joke?" he said. "Good morning, Derek." "Did you buy this house?" "I did." His jaw worked. "With what? Where did you—" He stopped, rearranging his face. "This is insane. You're living across the street from us? What is wrong with you?" "I fell in love with the neighborhood," I said pleasantly. "Claire is inside crying," he said. "Do you know that? She is genuinely upset by this." "I'm sorry Claire is upset. I hope she feels better." His voice dropped to something harder, less public. "You're doing this to mess with us. This is some kind of sick. Listen to me. You need to sell this house. You can't afford to maintain it, and you know it. This is harassment. I'll call a lawyer." "You're welcome to," I said. "I purchased this property through entirely legal means. The title is clean. The closing was properly conducted. You're welcome to verify any of that." I paused. "Would you like my attorney's contact information?" Something behind his eyes shifted, a small, rapid recalculation. He was not a stupid man. He was a reckless and entitled one, but he could identify when a confrontation wasn't moving in his direction. "We're not done with this conversation," he said. "I think we are for today," I said, and quietly closed the door. I stood in my entry hall and listened to his footsteps descend the porch stairs. I heard his truck door and the engine. Then I went back to arranging my bookshelves, though my hands were not quite steady for the next 10 minutes. That was all right. Steady hands weren't required for bookshelves. The following week was what I privately called my recovery week. Not from Derek, but from the accumulation of the previous 2 months. I had been running on forward momentum and legal strategy and sheer discipline. And underneath all of that was a 62-year-old woman who had been ejected from her daughter's home in October and was now living alone in a strange house across from the people who had done it. I allowed myself to feel it. I took long walks in the mornings. I cooked real meals instead of eating at my desk. I read a novel, a long one, something I'd been saving. I video called an old friend in Arizona and talked for 2 hours about nothing important. I slept 8 hours a night. On the last day of that week, I sat at my new kitchen table with my coffee and my laptop and opened my work files. The accounts were healthy. The clients were content. The house was mine. I had done the hard thing. Now I needed to be ready for what came next. Because Derek was not the kind of man who recalibrated quietly. He was the kind of man who came back. I intended to be ready when he did. He sent Claire first. That was predictable. Derek was smart enough to know that a direct second confrontation, so soon after the first, would give me more legal documentation and him less moral footing. So he sent my daughter, which was both a strategic choice and a cruelty, whether or not he recognized it as such. Claire knocked on my door on a Wednesday afternoon 10 days after I'd closed. She was wearing a coat I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago, which I noticed and said nothing about. She looked better than she had at the cafe in Summit, less strained, more composed, and I understood that she had been coached on what to say. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I said. She walked through the entry hall and into the living room, and I watched her eyes move across the space with the careful assessment of someone cataloging the sofa, the bookshelves, the restored fireplace, Robert's lamp in the study, visible through the open door. "This is a beautiful home, Mom," she said, and I believed her. That part, at least, was genuine. We sat across from each other. I offered tea. She accepted. "I want to apologize," she said. "Properly. Derek was wrong to ask you to leave the way he did. It was disrespectful, and I should have said something." "Yes," I said. "You should have." She absorbed that without flinching, which told me she'd prepared for it. "He regrets how it happened. He was stressed, and he handled it badly. We both want to move forward." "I'm moving forward," I said. "I'm very comfortable, as you can see." A pause. She turned her teacup in her hands. "He wanted me to ask, and I want to be clear, this is also something I'm wondering, whether you'd consider selling the property. He thinks it would be easier for everyone if—" "No," I said. "Just that. No. Mom, Claire, this is my home. I purchased it legally and I intend to live in it. I'm not going to sell it because it makes Derek uncomfortable." She looked at the fireplace. "He says he'll make it difficult." "He's welcome to try," I said, keeping my voice level. "I have excellent legal counsel and a very clean title. Anything he does that crosses a legal line will be documented and addressed accordingly." She left 40 minutes later, having drunk her tea, and said most of what she'd come to say. I walked her to the door and told her she was welcome to visit any time, alone, whenever she wanted to talk. She nodded without committing to anything, and I watched her cross the street in her Christmas coat. Was I tempted? To soften, to give an inch, to tell her it was all right and they could start over. The temptation was real. She was my daughter, and I had loved her since the moment she arrived in the world, and I had not stopped. But love is not the same as capitulation, and I was old enough and tired enough of pretending otherwise. The person who saved me that month, or rather steadied me, was my neighbor Barbara Kowalski. Barbara lived at 408 Sycamore, the house directly beside mine, and she had lived there for 22 years. She was 70, a retired high school principal, and she had the direct, no-drama energy of a person who had managed other people's emergencies for decades. She knocked on my door 2 weeks after I moved in with a plate of walnut brownies and no particular pretense. "I figured you'd need a neighbor by now," she said. "I'm Barbara. I saw you move in. I also saw the unpleasant business on your porch with the man from across the street." I liked her immediately. We had coffee that first afternoon and dinner the following Friday. Barbara knew the neighborhood the way longtime residents know places, its patterns, its gossip, its history. She had, it turned out, known the previous owners of my house. She had watched Derek and Claire move into number 409 4 years earlier. "He's a difficult man," Barbara said carefully over chicken piccata at her kitchen table. "He had a dispute with the Hendersons 2 doors down over a property line. It got unpleasant. He's the kind of man who needs to be the most important person in any situation." "Yes," I said. I noticed. "What's your plan?" she asked. She said it directly, the way principals ask questions, expecting a real answer, not a deflection. I told her the outline. Not the financial details, not yet, but the shape of it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once. "Good," she said. "You need a witness close by. I'm here." I also called my friend Donna Hartwell in Phoenix, who had been my closest friend since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class 30 years ago. Donna was a former corporate attorney who had, after her retirement, become what she described as professionally unbothered. She listened to the whole story and then said, "Maggie, you bought the house across the street. I need you to know that is genuinely one of the best things I've heard in years." We laughed for a long time. It was the first time I'd laughed, really laughed, since October. Donna promised to come visit in the spring when the magnolia bloomed. I told her I'd have the guest room ready. That evening, I sat on my front porch in the cold with a blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Number 409 was lit up across the street. The living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedroom, ordinary domestic light. I thought about what Derek expected me to do next. Sell, retreat, apologize for existing too close to his comfort. Instead, I pulled the blanket tighter, watched the light in his windows, and felt something settle in my chest, like a foundation stone being properly set. I was not afraid. I was not finished. I was simply waiting for the next move, and I had all the time in the world. They came on a Sunday, which told me it was planned. Derek never did anything spontaneous that required preparation. He was a man who staged his entrances. It was mid-December. I had just returned from morning services at the Episcopal Church I'd started attending. A quiet, beautiful old stone building on Baker Street, where nobody knew me and nobody asked questions. I had my coat still on when I saw them coming up the front walk. Claire with a bottle of wine and a tentative expression, Derek in a good jacket with his hands in his pockets, projecting the careful ease of someone performing casual. I let them in. I made coffee. I did not take the wine. Derek sat in the armchair across from the sofa and looked around the room with the slightly pinched expression of a man who wanted to appear relaxed, but was, in fact, conducting an appraisal. He had been in this house before, years ago, the one time it was briefly a rental, the same visit where I'd admired the crown molding. I wondered if he remembered that, or if he only remembered the things that served him. "Mom," Claire started, "we both wanted to come and talk, properly, not with everything being tense." "I appreciate that," I said. Derek cleared his throat. "Look, Maggie." He'd been using my first name for the last year, which I had disliked and said nothing about. "I've not handled things well. I want to own that." He said it the way men say things they have been told to say, correctly, technically, with the cadence of sincerity, but none of its texture. I waited. This whole situation, and here he gestured broadly as if the situation were something that had simply happened to all of us equally, has gotten out of hand, and I think we can all agree that you living directly across the street isn't healthy for anyone. "I find it quite healthy," I said. A flicker across his face. He smoothed it over. "What I'm saying is, we want to find a resolution. You're Claire's mother, your family. And I think if you're honest with yourself, Maggie, you'll admit that part of why you bought this specific property was to make a point, which, okay, I understand that. Message received. But now there's an opportunity to step back and make a real fresh start." He was good. I had to acknowledge it. The framing was elegant. He was offering me the exit ramp of being understood, which is one of the most effective tools of manipulation, because it makes capitulation feel like wisdom. "What kind of fresh start?" I asked. "You sell this place, you'll make a profit, the market's moved since you bought in, and you use that to find something in a different neighborhood, maybe closer to amenities. Claire and I would help you look." He leaned forward slightly, and in return, we sit down as a family and work through the financial piece that's been hanging over everything. There it was. Underneath the olive branch, the actual ask, "Sell the house, and then let's talk about your money." I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Claire, who was watching her hands. "Derek," I said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I think that's what this moment deserves. I am not selling this house. I am not moving to a different neighborhood. I am not negotiating my living situation with you as a condition of family peace." I paused. "And I am especially not going to discuss my finances in any context that you have initiated or structured." His composure fractured. Not dramatically. Derek was too controlled for scenes in unfamiliar rooms, but I saw the color come into his neck and the set of his jaw change. "You're being deliberately hostile," he said. "I'm being clear," I said. "I understand those can feel similar from certain perspectives." "This is not normal behavior," he said, his voice rising slightly despite himself. "No normal person buys a house across the street from their daughter's home after being asked to leave. You're doing this to punish us, and at some point Claire is going to see that, and it's going to damage your relationship with her permanently." He had calculated that this would hurt. He was right that it did. I felt the specific pain of it, the suggestion that my love for Claire was a weapon he could aim at me, move through my chest like cold water. But I had anticipated it. I had sat with the possibility of it on my porch in the December cold, in the evenings, turning it over until it became familiar. Known pain is manageable. Surprise is what undoes you. "Claire is my daughter," I said quietly. "Whatever our relationship becomes, it will be between her and me, not a negotiation you're part of." He stood up. Claire stood too, a half-second later, the automatic calibration of a woman who had practiced mirroring her husband's movements. "We're done here," he said. "I'll walk you to the door," I said. After they left, I stood in my entry hall for a while. The fear was there. I didn't deny it. The fear that he was right about Claire, that the daughter I had raised would eventually be more his than mine, that the house, the plan, the whole careful edifice would cost me the one person I'd been trying to protect, even while she'd been standing behind the man who hurt me. I breathed through it. I let it be real without letting it be final. Then I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and sent Helen a detailed email about the visit. I described what was said, the financial proposition Derek had made, and the implicit linkage between selling my home and working through the financial piece. Helen responded within the hour. This is important. What he proposed could constitute financial coercion depending on context. Keep documenting. We may need this. I printed the email. I filed it with the others. The fear had not gone away, but it had done what I'd learned over 62 years of living that fear can do when you don't fight it and don't surrender to it. It had become fuel. I was more certain than ever of what I needed to do, and I was almost ready to do it. The occasion was Barbara's annual neighborhood holiday gathering, held every December in her house at 408 Sycamore. She'd hosted it for 19 consecutive years, she told me. Potluck, BYOB, all the households on the block invited. It was, she explained when she invited me, the social center of the street. Derek and Claire always come, she added, with the calm delivery of someone laying a chess piece on the board. Of course they do, I said. Will that be a problem for you? Not in the least, I said. I had been preparing for this moment, not specifically the party, but the inevitability of what it represented, for several weeks. Helen had advised me, and I had listened carefully. Donna, who had visited for 4 days in early December, had sat across from me at the kitchen table and helped me think through every scenario. Barbara, who had become something I hadn't expected in this chapter of my life, a true friend, had been a quiet, steadying witness. And I had done one other thing. I had, with Helen's guidance and in consultation with a forensic accountant she worked with, formally documented what Derek had done, using Claire to access my estate records without my knowledge or consent for the purpose of financial assessment. It wasn't a criminal case, but it was a pattern of behavior, documented and organized, that painted a clear and unflattering portrait. I arrived at Barbara's at 7 p.m. with a bowl of my grandmother's butternut squash soup and a bottle of good Chardonnay. The house was warm and full. I knew several faces by then. The Hendersons, whom Derek had once fought over a property line, the young couple from the new build at the corner, the retired science teacher who walked his beagle past my house every morning. Derek and Claire arrived at 7:20. I watched from across the room as Derek took in my presence, the slight check in his step, the rapid reset of his expression into something neutral and social. He was wearing a nice sweater. He shook hands and smiled. For the first hour, we moved in different orbits, as people do at parties where proximity is uncomfortable. I talked with the Hendersons, who were warm and funny, and who mentioned, without any prompting from me, that they had found Derek challenging to deal with during the property dispute. I filed this away not for use, but for confirmation. It was Derek who forced the collision. I suspect he had been drinking steadily enough that his calculations softened. He came to stand beside me near the bookshelf in Barbara's living room in the middle of a group conversation and said, too loudly, too casually, "So, Maggie, settling in okay? Must be strange, starting over at your age." The group quieted slightly. At your age. The diminishment was deliberate. He wanted witnesses to my smallness. "I'm finding it wonderful, actually," I said. "It's an excellent house." "Expensive, though," he said, "for a retiree." The room had gone carefully, socially quiet in the way rooms do when something uncomfortable begins to happen. People weren't leaving the conversation, they were listening to it. I manage my finances well, I said. I've done so for many years. Must have been nice, Derek said, having Robert's money to fall back on. That was the moment. He had maneuvered himself into making it about my dead husband's money, dismissing my 34-year career as incidental, reducing me to an inheritance. In front of a room of our neighbors, I looked at him steadily. Derek, I said, I earned my income independently throughout my career, and I continue to do so. The property I purchased was acquired with my own funds from my own consulting practice and structured through a limited liability company I've maintained for many years. I paused. I know you've had questions about my financial situation for some time. I hope that answers some of them. The silence was complete. Derek's neck had gone red. I don't know what You asked Claire to share my estate documents with you, I said. My voice was even. She told me herself. I've documented that conversation, along with the proposal you made during your December visit, in which you connected the sale of my home to discussions about my finances. I kept my tone conversational, as if I were describing a recipe. I'm not raising this to cause a scene. I'm raising it because you chose a public venue to suggest, again, that my financial independence is illegitimate. I'd prefer we all have an accurate picture. Derek opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked around at the faces in the room, the Hendersons, the retired teacher, Barbara standing very still near the doorway. And something in him seemed to understand that he had, in his eagerness to diminish me, stepped off the edge of something he couldn't step back onto. This is insane, he said. He looked at Claire, who was standing very still near the hallway. Claire, are you going to let your mother do this? Claire said nothing. Her face was very pale. I think, Barbara said from the doorway, calm, clear, the voice of a woman who had managed high school hallways for 30 years, that we should all take a breath. Derek put down his glass. He looked at me one more time with an expression that had moved entirely past performance into something unguarded. He was afraid, not of me personally, but of what I had just demonstrated. That I was not what he decided I was, that I had been patient and prepared and completely unintimidated, and that all of this had been witnessed. He left shortly after. Claire followed, pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Complicated, layered, something that might, in time, become an apology. I stayed until 10 o'clock. I helped Barbara wash the soup bowls. She walked me to the door and squeezed my hand. That was beautifully done, she said. I just told the truth, I said. Yes, she said. That's what made it beautiful. The call came from Claire on a Tuesday morning in January, 12 days after Barbara's party. I was at my desk reviewing a client portfolio when my phone lit up with her name. I answered on the second ring. Mom. Her voice was different. Not the prepared, coached voice of the December visits, something rawer underneath it. I need to ask you something. Of course, I said. I need to know. And here she stopped, reorganized. I need to know if what you said at Barbara's party was true, about him asking me to get your documents, about the conversation at your house in December. Every word was true, I said. A long silence. Then, he told me you made it up. That you're trying to destabilize our marriage because you're, he said lonely, and bitter about Dad. I let that land and settle. What do you think? I asked. Another silence. I think, she said slowly, that I told you myself about the documents. In the cafe in Summit. I said it to your face. A pause. and I think I knew what I was saying when I said it. We talked for 2 hours. This was not the coached conversation of the previous months. This was my daughter, finding her way back through the sediment of 4 years of choices she'd been slowly regretting. She cried. I listened. I did not offer her absolution immediately because she didn't need absolution. She needed honesty, and honesty is not the same thing as comfort. She had already called a divorce attorney. She told me this near the end of the call, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has made a decision and is now in the process of living it out. She had spoken to an attorney named Gail Rosenberg who worked out of Millburn. She had been gathering documents quietly on her own for the past 8 days. "Are you safe?" I asked. "Physically." "Yes," she said. "He's not violent. He's not a good person, Mom. I've known it for a while. I didn't want to know it." "I know," I said. "That's the hardest kind of knowing." Derek's unraveling was not cinematic. It was the quiet, grinding unraveling of a man who had built his identity on managing the perceptions of others, and who found that capacity failing on multiple fronts simultaneously. The neighbors on Sycamore Lane knew what had happened at Barbara's party. In small communities, the texture of a public scene stays in the air. Derek had walked out of that party having revealed himself. The condescension, the financial fixation, the collapse under a calm and accurate response, and the people on that street who had 4 years of their own small accumulations about him now had a framework for what they'd observed. He lost a business account in February. I learned this indirectly through Barbara, who had mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance. The account was a mid-size regional retailer that his company had held for 3 years. The decision to move to another vendor was unrelated to anything on Sycamore Lane, but timing is its own kind of meaning. Claire filed for divorce in February. She hired Gail Rosenberg, who was, Helen told me when I mentioned the name, extremely capable. The filing was clean and the grounds were appropriately documented. Derek hired a lawyer, contested several items, and quickly discovered that contesting becomes expensive and rarely goes the way the contesting party imagines. He had to sell the house. This was a mathematical outcome. Without Claire's income and with the cost of legal fees and a second residence, the mortgage on 409 Sycamore became unmanageable. The house sold in April for a number that left Derek with very little equity after the mortgage payoff and the settlement terms. On the day of the closing on 409, I happened to be on my front porch with my morning coffee. I was not there deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. I watched the moving truck. I watched Derek carry boxes out of the front door, alone, without the effortful ease of a man confident in his circumstances. He looked across the street once. I was visible on my porch. He held the look for a moment, then looked away and kept walking. I did not feel triumph exactly. What I felt was something quieter, the particular satisfaction of having remained exactly who I was throughout an ordeal designed to make me doubt it. I had not lied. I had not manipulated. I had not wielded my money as a weapon, only as the evidence it was. Evidence of a life I'd built, documented, and protected. Derek had tried to assess my value and found me wanting. I had simply gone about demonstrating otherwise. Helen called that afternoon. I heard 409 close today. "It did," I said. "How are you feeling?" I thought about it. "Settled," I said, "like the house has finally stopped holding its breath." She laughed. "Get some rest, Maggie. You've earned it." I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking out at the backyard. The magnolia in the front yard was beginning, just barely, to show the first promise of buds, small and tight and absolutely certain, in their unhurried way, of everything that was coming. Donna arrived in April as she'd promised, just as the Magnolia opened. I met her at Newark Airport and drove her back to Sycamore Lane through the kind of spring afternoon that makes New Jersey feel, briefly, like a gift. She stood on my front porch, looked at the magnolia in full, extravagant bloom, white and pink and completely indifferent to everything that had happened around it, and said, "Maggie, you absolute legend." We spent a week together. We cooked elaborate meals, walked the neighborhood in the mornings, and stayed up too late at Barbara's kitchen table, drinking wine and talking about the things women our age talk about when they're finally, properly free of managing everyone else's feelings. It was the best week I'd had in years. My work continued to grow. I had taken on 2 new retainer clients in January, and by spring my monthly income had edged above $90,000. I didn't need more than I had, but the growth was its own kind of validation, that the life I'd built was real, was mine, was not contingent on anyone's permission. I began hosting small dinners. Barbara came often. The Hendersons came twice. Donna's visits became quarterly. A former colleague from Boston reconnected through a mutual friend, a recently retired cardiologist named Patricia, with strong opinions about wine and a remarkably similar set of experiences with difficult sons-in-law. We had a lot to talk about. Claire moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in South Orange in March. She'd taken a full-time position at a dental practice in Livingston. The first time she'd worked full hours since the year after her wedding. She looked different, more present in herself. Our relationship was careful at first, the way relationships are when both people are finding the new shape of them. We met for coffee, then for dinner, then slowly for longer and more honest conversations. She came to my house for Sunday dinner in May and sat at the kitchen table, the one with 6 chairs, and said simply, looking around the room, "I'm glad you have this." "Me too," I said. Derek had a harder spring. He'd moved into an apartment off Route 24, lost his sales position in March, and was consulting independently with mixed results. I felt no particular satisfaction in any of it. He was a man who had spent considerable energy deciding other people's worth was his to calculate, and he was now living inside the results of that habit. That is not punishment. That is simply life organizing itself according to its own logic. I started a kitchen garden in the back of the house. I bought a hanging chair for the front porch and sat there in the warm evenings with my tea, watching the light change on Sycamore Lane. The house at 409 had new owners, a young family from Brooklyn with 2 small children. The mother waved from the driveway. I waved back and brought them lasagna. I was 62 years old. I had a house I loved, work I was proud of, a daughter finding her way back to me, and friends who had chosen my corner without being asked. Robert's lamp cast its warm light across my study every evening. I was not the person Derek had calculated me to be. I had never been, and the magnolia would bloom again next spring. I was certain of it.